It was the summer of 1943. The Atlantic Ocean had become a deadly theater of war, where the fate of nations was sealed by the forces of steel, fire, and blood. Nazi U-boats, sleek and silent, prowled the depths, hunting the lifeblood of Allied supply lines. The men on the ships, in the planes, and beneath the waves were locked in a deadly dance, one where a single mistake could mean death. But then, something extraordinary happened. As the world watched in disbelief, American shipyards churned out warships at a pace that left the Germans in shock. The engineering marvels that emerged from these yards weren't just ships. They were symbols of resilience, ingenuity, and speed. The Germans, who had once been the masters of precision and efficiency, found themselves facing an enemy who could produce ships faster than they could destroy them. And in the shadow of this industrial miracle, the U-boats, once a terrifying weapon, seemed suddenly inadequate. The year was 1942. The Allies were struggling. After years of unrelenting bombardments and the constant threat of Nazi victory, the world found itself on the edge of collapse. The United States, though determined, was still shaking off the shock of Pearl Harbor, trying to mobilize its war machine. On the other side, Germany, under the command of Adolf Hitler, was enjoying dominance. The Wehrmacht, with its precision tactics, had already conquered most of Europe, while the U-boats ruled the seas. These submarines were the terror of the Atlantic, their stealth and firepower cutting down Allied convoys and choking supply lines. Yet America's response was swift. At the heart of the United States strategy lay one simple yet impossible-sounding idea: mass production. The country had vast factories, an almost limitless supply of raw materials, and an unrelenting will to win. But could they truly turn the tide of the war with an untested industrial solution? As the Germans watched, they didn't expect much. America's shipyards were sluggish, antiquated, and unprepared for the scale of the war effort. Yet, in the span of a few short months, the American industrial machine proved them wrong. In cities like Norfolk, San Francisco, and Seattle, massive yards were cleared. Assembly lines were set up. Tools that had never seen war use were pressed into action, and entire fleets of ships were constructed. More than just speed, the quality of the vessels was staggering. The Germans had no concept of what they were about to face. The Americans were building ships as if time itself were against them. And the German engineers, who had once built the world's most feared warships, were stunned by the relentless pace. In the dead of night, the sound of rivets being hammered echoed across American shipyards. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat, almost as if the yards themselves were alive, pulsing with an energy unseen before. As the sun rose, more ships were launched. Where the Germans had once set the bar for efficiency, the Americans shattered it. The first shock came in the form of the Liberty ship. The type of vessel designed for mass production, these ships were nearly 440 feet long, weighed over 10,000 tons, and could carry everything from tanks to food supplies. They were the backbone of the American war effort, and they were being built at a rate so fast it baffled the Germans. In just a matter of weeks, the first Liberty ship was completed. But the real shock was that the construction time was reduced from over 200 days to just 42. The Germans had thought it impossible, so fast that they feared the Allies had discovered some new, unthinkable method of construction. This escalation in production wasn't merely about quantity, it was about technological advancements too. Shipbuilders harnessed new welding techniques, made use of prefabricated sections, and even devised methods for constructing entire sections of the ship simultaneously. The Germans couldn't understand how a nation that had been caught unawares by the war was now, in the span of a few months, able to produce warships with such devastating speed and efficiency. But there was another shock on the horizon. What the Germans didn't know was that America had unlocked an industrial secret that would forever change the face of warfare. It wasn't just the ships. It was the relentless, unstoppable force behind their creation. The vast, near unlimited resources of the American industrial complex. But what they didn't know was that radar had learned to listen. The turning point came in the summer of 1943, as the Americans, unleashed wave after wave of new ships. The Germans realized that the war in the Atlantic had changed. The U-boats, which had once been the most feared weapon of war, were now being hunted with a ferocity that mirrored the efficiency of American shipbuilding. The Germans had underestimated the impact of America's mass production. They had also underestimated the power of their radar, which had evolved rapidly, allowing them to track U-boats with terrifying precision. American bombers, flying from newly constructed aircraft carriers, took to the skies with a singular mission: destroy the U-boats before they could strike. Meanwhile, new depth-charge technologies, developed alongside the rapid production of ships, allowed Allied forces to counter U-boat attacks with more accuracy and lethality. The first battle of the new phase of the Atlantic War was fought not just on the water, but in the skies. American planes, launched from newly constructed aircraft carriers, began to attack German U-boats with devastating accuracy. The air was filled with the sound of engines roaring, bombs falling, and the growing realization that the German U-boats were losing their dominance in the Atlantic. It wasn't just a battle of technology, it was a battle of industrial power, of nations harnessing their resources to an unprecedented degree. The new American ships were arriving faster than ever, with their armed forces eager and ready. The relentless wave of production and technological advancement created an unbreakable momentum. And as the U-boats found themselves outmatched in both numbers and technology, the Germans knew they were fighting an enemy with an industrial engine they couldn't outpace. America's shipyards had become a war machine in itself, and this new industrial warfare was now the greatest weapon in the Allies' arsenal. The Atlantic had become a battlefield of steel and fire, where speed and sheer force determined the victor. But in the heat of this battle, there was one final shock for the Germans. Their very reliance on their most fearsome weapon, the U-boats, had become their undoing. They had never anticipated that America's industrial power would not just match their own, but overwhelm it with unprecedented speed. In the silence that followed the final battles of the Atlantic, the ocean remembered everything. The once feared U-boats, which had terrorized Allied convoys for years, were now being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The Germans, who had once believed their technological superiority was unmatched, were forced to face the grim truth. America's industrial might had changed the course of history. By 1944, as Allied forces gained ground on both the European and Pacific fronts, it was clear that the war would no longer be won through conventional means alone. The United States had embraced an industrial revolution that no one, not even the most seasoned generals, had predicted. The massive shipyards of Norfolk, Baltimore, and Long Beach had become symbols of America's resolve, a resolve that was built upon a foundation of innovation, relentless labor, and ingenuity. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were built in just over 4 years. These ships, though not the most advanced in design, became a lifeline for the Allied forces. They carried everything from troops to tanks, food to fuel, ensuring that the front lines were always supplied. The Germans had no way of halting the flow of supplies from America's industrial hubs, and this became one of the decisive factors in the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. But the war was more than just about the numbers. It was about the human spirit. Thousands of workers, many of whom were women and minorities, streamed into the shipyards every day. They didn't just work with their hands. They worked with the knowledge that they were part of something far bigger than themselves. For many, it wasn't just about the victory at the end of the war. It was about the victory that had already been won on the home front. The unity that Americans found in their factories and shipyards laid the groundwork for a post-war world that would reshape not only Europe but the entire globe. While the Liberty ship was the most iconic product of America's wartime industrial efforts, the ingenuity did not stop there. New materials, advanced welding techniques, and the practice of mass production would forever change the way the world viewed manufacturing. The scale and speed at which the U.S. mobilized its resources created a new definition of industrial warfare, one where a factory could become as deadly as a tank and an assembly line as lethal as a gun. When the war ended in 1945, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a victory of will, determination, and industrial might. The United States had risen from the depths of shock and despair following Pearl Harbor to become the world's foremost industrial power, a transformation that had been spearheaded by its shipyards. And in those factories, where the engines of war were built and fueled, was a deeper, more lasting legacy. As the victorious Allies sailed into a world forever changed, one thing was clear: America's industrial power had altered the very nature of warfare. The new methods of mass production, technological innovation, and the relentless pursuit of progress had not only tipped the balance of the war, but also changed the course of human history. The ships that sailed out of America's shipyards didn't just carry soldiers, they carried the future. In the end, it wasn't just the steel and rivets that forged America's victory. It was the indomitable spirit of its people, working together toward an impossible goal. And in that relentless production, America's victory was built, one ship at a time.